Today we're going to talk about inspecting a used turntable, because a lot of people have expressed interest in my knowledge about turntables. And this turntable was brought into us. It's a Thorens TD160 Super. It's unusual because it came with a Grace logo on its top plate. We'll have a little better picture of it for you, or you can do it now. It has a Grace 707 tone arm on it, which was essentially the cat's meow in the 80s. I own several of them. Usually they were silver. This is a black one. And what we want to figure out is, what is this table all about? So the first thing we have to do is drop the bottom plate. This was done for a number of reasons. One is to look at what's going on underneath, and the other thing was to release a clamp actually holding the inner platter in place. On Thorens, that's rather unusual. Usually they pull straight out. And what we've discovered is essentially a hobbyist turntable. The Grace 707 tone arm was added after the fact, and rather coming out of its normal slot here, this was cut out and some foam was put in, and that's how it came out. And the suspension was done with a audiophile grade bread tie. I don't know what brand of bread is, and I don't think it really matters. But what we have is something that's interfering with the natural suspension of a Thorens. Thorens turntables are a 3-point suspension, and in fact they are tunable just like a Lin LP12. Most people don't realize that. It's done to a lower quality because the nuts that are used are not locking nuts, so they can wander and its just tuning can go out of place. So now we're going to move to the top side so we can see kind of what's going on from the bottom. Okay, now from the beginning, the first thing we want to look at is the actual bearing of the platter system. If the bearing is shot or is highly worn, it's going to introduce noise or vibration, which the stylus will eventually pick up. So this one would release the lock. We're pulling out the bearing. This has a shaped bearing. Many of them can be flat with a captured ball bearing in the well. And we're going to wipe this bearing off, and we're going to actually look at it. And we can look at it from the side, and we see nothing abnormal. And then we're going to take a very careful look at the actual contact point. And we're looking for a couple things. If the turntable has been abused and bounced around in movement without care, you're going to see on the very tip a wear spot that'll be very, very small, or can be the size of a head of a pin. If it's a head of a pin, it's over. If it's severely been bounced, you'll actually see rings around the very point, indicating where the bearing has punched into the thrust plate, and I'll explain that in a moment, and is actually running another groove point, pivot point on the thrust plate itself. This bearing looks really, really nice, so I like that. Now, when we talk about the thrust plate, we're actually looking at the piece of metal at the very bottom of the well where the bearing sits. And we look at to see how big the spot is down there. Now this bearing has been lubricated, which is usually not the case with Thorens. Sometimes it is. And so seeing that spot down there is a little difficult. So we're going to clean that out and see what we have. So now we're actually going to look at the most important thing on a turntable, which is the bearing. As we discussed, the bearing itself looks good. Now we're going to look into the bearing well and the thrust plate. That is what the bearing sits on. With many manufacturers, they end up using differential metals, one being softer than the other, which is not ideal at all, because the harder substance will burnish or bear into the softer one. Thorens is pretty good about not doing that. So now we look at how the table was handled and whether it was cared for. And if you come look down the bearing well, if we get a good picture of it, you'll actually see, as we work on it, you can see a little dot. That dot represents a couple things. It represents, one, the potential of wear from general use, and it is an older turntable. The other thing it can represent, and is more likely in the case of this turntable, is that in this case, the inner platter was not elevated or kept from bouncing on the bearing, the thrust plate, by simply elevating it and locking it so that it doesn't have the opportunity to bang. So on a grade level, this is not a 10. 7 or 8, yes. Is it something that you'll hear? Maybe a little, depending upon the price of the table, could be acceptable or not. This is far above average of what I typically see on a Thorens turntable. Most of them, I'll just look at them and say, well, I can't sell them because they don't represent what the table was when it was originally sold. Thorens does a much better job at bearings and their development than many others. Some of them even go so far as to use plastic ball bearings in there, which after a couple of years aren't worth anything. They're really rather bad. So we'll grade this one as a 7 or 8 in terms of that. Now we're going to move on from the platter system. The other thing I'd quickly noticed is if you look at the top plate, you can see where the outer platter was actually skimming or rubbing on, you know, the cover plate. This is usually a warning sign as to that the table's been allowed to bounce around and with little protection to the inner platter or the bearing itself. And as I say, when you're dealing with used turntables, unless you actually get to personally and physically inspect them, you're really buying a pig in the poke. And God help you if a guy found one in a thrift shop, because he doesn't even have a clue as to what's going on. He just sees big numbers on eBay or any other site and just launches it. Okay, so we're going to leave that go for a second. We're going to move over to the tone arm. And this is where most turntables really break down. And where they break down is actually problems with the bearing system. Because they've been moved around with the counterweight on, moved around and back to cars and things like that. When a turntable is moved, the counterweight itself should be taken off so that you're not putting additional stress on the bearings. And the simple test for the tone arm is whether it is still good, is to check the bearings. And the way one does this is holding it like this or with your finger on top for balance. And you give it just a very gentle side-to-side twist, clockwise and counterclockwise. You're checking the vertical bearings, and then when we're checking the horizontal, we give a slight push and pull again. This particular tone arm, the tone arm, in terms of this test, is fine. Okay, we've pulled another used turntable that's come into us. And I'm going to get more specific about what you may see, feel, or hear when you're dealing with a troubled tone arm. This happens to be a Sony table, and I say that because a lot of turntables, regardless of brand, already have this problem, and Sony just happens to be the one on display. Here, I'm going to give it the slight twist, and I can feel a little glitch, but when I go back to forth, perhaps you can hear that. There's some play in this. What this means is that the tone arm is not properly working, that its vibrations may be added to what the cartridge picks up. Whatever the cartridge picks up, the vibration is going to go down and then it's going to come back up the tone arm. It's certainly not ideal. So in terms of, is this a way that perhaps like Sony made it? I doubt it. This shows movement, again, probably with the counterweight on, and this is what can happen. So again, you can't see that from pictures of advertising. Everything looks wonderful. And the reality is you actually have to physically look, physically inspect it. You have to mechanically look at certain things. And these are the sort of things that are going to come up. Is a table like this better than something that sells for $149 on Amazon today? Probably so. I don't make that guarantee. because I have no idea what even quality can come out of a table that probably produced for like $25. But these are the sort of things you look for in a turntable. This one has the convenience of a removable head shell. Removable head shells are not ideal at the audiophile level. They are a convenience, so you can change cartridges. Hopefully you get the jig so that you know exactly where this stylus should sit in the front to back position so that it properly goes across the record. I've brought out one of the templates we use, in this case for Lynn turntables, and what you'll see is their engineering is from pivot point to where the stylus should be, and their engineering is 229 millimeters. And then there's a specific arc where it crosses over the record. And the stylus should stay in that arc the entire time. If it's too far forward or too far back, either in the front or the back, the cartridge is not properly mounted, and it's going to result in distortion and mistracking either on the inner or outer grooves. Some of them will come with a little AB plate, which this one also has, so you can mechanically look again what's going on. But your turntable should come with some sort of overhang gauge or a template to allow you to properly mount the cartridge. Okay, so what we've done is we've basically looked at two turntables that have come in that are going to be offered for sale. And as I said, before we do anything, we like to know exactly what it's all about, so it can be fairly represented. I do dearly love the Thorens turntables. It's belt driven. This one will need a new belt. If a turntable's been sitting for 2 or 3 years unused, the belt's already stretched out of shape. It's kind of like a tire left in a parking lot and the car's hadn't been moved for a couple of years. The convenience of direct drive is you don't have to deal with belts. This is probably a semi-automatic or automatic. And there's sometimes people who need that type of feature to enjoy vinyl. They just can't deal with it. This one comes with a lifter. This is an aftermarket one. They were pretty neat. They weren't always reliable, but they have little trip springs. So it lifted the arm up for this owner. So it acted kind of like a semi-automatic, but without the problems of all the semi-automatic or automatic gears chattering around in the sub-chassis and creating its own set of problems, as well as interfering with the movement of the arm itself. And they do, they're mechanical. So there we are. Hope you enjoy. If you have any questions, feel free to write us on our website or respond on this video, and I'll try to do the best I can to give you respectable answers. And there we are. While we're underneath the turntable, the other thing I wanted to point out is not only securing the inner platter so that it doesn't bounce around, but many Thorens turntables and other ones actually have transport locks. Thorens has them on the side, and they're accessible through the bottom plate. And this is to make sure that even the motor system and the springs and such don't bounce around and come out of tune. They should also be locked and in place. I once received an Oracle turntable shipped out of Texas that might as well have been in a paper bag, because by the time I received it, the toning pillars were all bent, the tone arm was destroyed, the inner platter and platter system was just wandering all over the box. Amazingly, the only thing that survived properly was the cartridge, and that should have been the first thing destroyed. So here we are, we're going to be putting the turntable away, and to avoid doing any further damage, I've taken a paper towel and I've folded it up a number of times, and this has lifted the inner platter off the thrust plate. So as we now move it about the store, we're not going to add any more to that little bearing plate problem or thrust plate problem that we showed you earlier.